Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this DSA Summit session. This is a very interesting session because we are going to focus on connectivity. Let me tell you a little bit of background about this. We usually at the DSA Summit, we talk about different frequency bands, about power levels, about different technologies and techniques. And we wanted to highlight in this session the importance of connectivity. So why are we working on providing more and better connectivity? So for this, we will have three speakers that are going to share with us their experience and all the different actions that they have been leading in different regions of the world. So let's start with our first speaker. She is Alessandra Lustrati. Alessandra is the head of digital development in the UK government's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, so FCDO. And as part of her role, Alessandra leads the Global Digital Access Program, as well as overseeing a policy and programming portfolio focused on digital inclusion, digital transformation, and she's also responsible for digital technologies in developing countries and emerging markets. She has been leading a lot of amazing initiatives, and we would really love to hear from her. So welcome, Alessandra, and thank you for accepting this invitation from the DSA.
Thank you so much, Martha, for this great introduction, and also many thanks to the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance for this invitation to speak at this really important global summit on a new spectrum mindset. Today, I will be speaking to you about inclusive connectivity as a key enabler of development. And I will be framing this within our policy priorities of FCDO on digital development. So a little bit about the rationale and the strategic context. First of all, why we work on digital development is because we believe that the inclusive and sustainable use of digital technologies can support economic development, social development, and improve governance. And actually, the UK government has quite a history of investing in digital for development in the past few years in our partner countries, meaning developing countries and emerging markets, working on digital as a cross-cutting enabler, but also as a really important element in specific sectors like education, health, finance, etc. And our most recent strategy is doing development in a digital world 2018-20 by the former Department for International Development. And we are currently actually busy as the new Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office we are busy updating and refreshing this strategy, focusing on our three key policy areas: digital inclusion, digital transformation, and responsible digital. I will actually focus a little bit more on the digital inclusion side of things in this presentation, because this is where we feel that the new spectrum mindset is really most relevant and really important for contributing to our objectives of inclusive digital connectivity. But let me give you an overview of the different areas and a little bit about their constitutive elements. So first of all, digital inclusion. We take a holistic approach to it. And what do we really mean by digital inclusion? It's about ensuring that no one is left behind in a digital world, and that basically all institutions, businesses, and users in our partner countries can harness the benefits of digital technologies to facilitate inclusive economic growth, social development, and good governance. And we also place a very strong focus on underserved and vulnerable groups and communities, including paying attention to exclusion factors like gender, disability, age, remote locations, and other factors. We work both at market and systemic level to support the digital inclusion. So we focus on testing and validating innovative and scalable technology and business models for sustainable and inclusive connectivity, digital literacy and skills, locally relevant digital content and services for underserved communities. But we also look at the bigger picture. So we want to make sure that there is a conducive environment for digital inclusion by working with our partner countries in improving the relevant policy, legal, and regulatory frameworks, and on strengthening the capacity of relevant institutions. The key drivers of digital inclusion for us are really, very importantly, affordable and sustainable last mile connectivity, a real foundation block, but also locally relevant digital content and services on the kind of supply side. On the demand or user side, we really pay attention on whether underserved communities have the actual awareness of the benefits of being online, and whether they are facing any attainability barrier, for example, brought about by social norms like genders or physical barriers like disability. And importantly, we want to make sure that underserved communities also can build their own digital literacy and skills to ensure that they can engage in a digital world in a way that is really productive and meaningful for them. We've done quite a bit of more sort of detailed analysis in our policy thinking on inclusive on digital inclusion, and you can see here all the foundational elements. But I will just for today focus on connectivity and affordability that are really important, obviously, for inclusive digital access. So under connectivity, we look specifically at coverage and quality, connectivity models, the infrastructure, the backbone, and middle mile level, last mile technologies, and energy access. And then we look at the cost element or the cost dimension of it, the cost of data, of devices, of equipment, or of infrastructure, the cost of taxation, the cost of energy. And then even more importantly, all of this, all the elements of digital inclusion are sitting within a broader environment that we call like the enabling environment for digital inclusion. And as you can see at the bottom of this diagram, there are basically two main elements to it: the policy, legal, and regulatory framework and the market ecosystem. And in the policy, legal, and regulatory framework, I've highlighted here spectrum allocation because really it is for us really like a foundational element of how the business environment can enable the sort of most appropriate models for digital inclusion. I'll go briefly through digital transformation, which is about the slightly wider processes that we try to facilitate in partner countries to ensure that these countries can actually embrace digital technologies to positively transform the way their governments, economies, and societies function, with quite an emphasis on a whole of government approach to digitalization to make sure that citizens can access effective government digital services. We look at the role of digital in the economy by supporting digitalization of firms and supply chains and trade. And then also importantly, we look at the role of digital in society by supporting basically digital technologies for civic engagement and to ensure that citizens can really use digital to amplify their voice and to protect their rights. And you can see in this visual a little bit of the elements that we've been analyzing and the digital transformation of economy, government, and society. And then last but not least, responsible digital for us is really underpinning everything else. We feel that if we promote digital inclusion and transformation, we also need to be responsible to enable and to support our partner countries and the users and the local organizations in managing the risks and challenges of being online. So we want to promote and support a safe and secure and resilient digital environment, putting a lot of attention to the on the most marginalized groups and the ones that are most vulnerable to digital harms. And we want to support an online safety and security more broadly, to ensure that rights and values and privacy online are protected, to ensure that there is trust in the digital system, that freedom of online expression is protected, and that we counter online misinformation and disinformation. And you can see here in this visual a few of the elements that we have analyzed as being, the kind of most important in the main digital risks and harms. But let's go back a little bit to digital inclusion per se, given that it's so relevant to inclusive connectivity and also to the sort of connective topic of spectrum. The example that I give you today is our digital access program, which is a partnership of the FCDO, Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, with our digital department in government, DCMS. It's part of the UK Prosperity Fund, and this program operates in Brazil, Indonesia, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. The approach that we take is to provide systemic and market-level technical assistance and capacity building to catalyze inclusive, safe, and secure digital access for underserved communities and to stimulate digital innovations for local development challenges. I will only now focus on the component of the digital access program that is about digital inclusion, where we actually try to kind of support all the foundational elements: inclusive connectivity, digital literacy and skills, locally relevant digital content, digital services. And in particular, obviously, I will zoom into inclusive connectivity, as you can imagine, looking at how we work on it. We work on it by looking at the enablers and the models. Some few kind of, quite quick examples. We have provided specialized technical assistance support to the government of Nigeria on defining the new national broadband plan that was launched by the Nigerian president in January this year. And we've also supported the government of Nigeria on improving the administration of the right-of-way regulation in a way that basically helps in reducing the cost of deployment of backbone and sort of middle mile connectivity infrastructure to make sure that the most sort of underserved regions and areas of Nigeria are also reached by connectivity. In Kenya, we've provided TA support to the ICT authority to make sure that the new national ICT plan has a really strong digital inclusion lens and looks at all the foundational elements of digital inclusion. I'll go into a bit more detail of two other interesting examples, always from the Digital Access Program. In Kenya, we've been working on promoting TV Whitespace regulation with the Communications Authority of Kenya. Basically, we provided technical assistance on regulating for the commercial deployment of TV Whitespace last mile technology through designing and funding a field research project with Strathmore University from Kenya for the validation of the model scale up. And we've collaborated with the DSA, with Microsoft, and with the local TV Whitespace company, Mawingo Networks, which actually has been the first local company to deploy a TV Whitespace in Laikipia County, on sharing industry experience and best practice on spectrum implication. And we've done this because we really believe that these type of technologies can really make a difference in increasing inclusive connectivity in underserved areas. Also equally important for us is thinking about not just the technology, but also the organizational models. And we are very keen on supporting models that are community-led, because that gives a lot of really local ownership and is essentially more sustainable from the developmental perspective. So we support community networks development. We are doing this in various ways. We've done capacity building of community networks leaders in South Africa with the Internet Society, with the Association for Progressive Communication, and with the local network, Zenzeleni. We are building local digital skills and organizational capacity of community networks in rural Indonesia with Common Room Foundation, Networks Foundation. And we are also with the APC. We've been working on a global project in the 5 countries of the Digital Access Program to provide more kind of systemic support at micro, meso, and macro level for community-led inclusive connectivity models, and also to enable cross-country learning. So, okay, so we've done quite a lot of thinking and quite a lot of programming work. Some initial reflections. From the learning so far, I think in terms of development donor perspective on promoting inclusive connectivity, I can share with you maybe some 10 points that I hope will be useful. So first of all, we've really found that inclusive connectivity is absolutely foundational for digital development, even if, you know, there is a bit of thinking sometimes from different stakeholders saying that there is already coverage, you know, pretty much everywhere, but the actual digital access is not there for pretty much half of the world population. So we need to be really thinking hard of that. But inclusive connectivity is also very complex, and it requires working at both systemic and market level. In doing that, we need to make sure that the enablers are context specific, and that we come at it in a very tech agnostic way without preconceptions on technologies and models. We have to consider really key elements like telecom regulations, the capacity of the regulator, the competition policy, the market structure, and also its political economy, which, as you all know very well, then influences the way spectrum, for example, is looked at as how to manage that kind of scarce resource in a particular type of market. In all of this, obviously, last mile technological innovations and business models are key. Dynamic spectrum allocation, as I already said, is fundamental, and for us it underpins essentially the achievement of inclusive digital access. In order to work on that, we need to adopt a multi-stakeholders and cross-sectoral approach, working with government, with private sector, with civil society, but also with the universities and research. We need to engage with regulators and industry in a way that is that we have let's say from a neutral perspective, so that we can be facilitators of the dialogue. As a development donor, we also have to be very conscious of where we can add value. We are not stepping in to pay for infrastructure or investing directly in technology, but we can add a lot of value in terms of facilitating policy dialogue, providing technical assistance, building capacity, and doing knowledge sharing. And finally, leveraging private sector investment through strategic corporate partnerships is also really important. For example, we have a letter of intent with the Airband initiative of Microsoft as Digital Access Program, and we just use it in a really fluid way to just align and sort of coordinate, like we've done in Kenya, for example, on TV Whitespace, space, and make sure that our respective forms of support to partner countries are really complementary. So having that kind of dialogue with the private sector is also extremely important. Well, I'll leave it at that. I hope that this was somehow useful and interesting for you. Please reach out with comments and any questions. And I wish you all the best in continuing to work on Spectrum. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alessandra, for this presentation. Very, very interesting. And it's great to hear like how this vision of inclusion is being used and implemented, and you are supporting projects in different countries and different regions. That's amazing. And also with different stakeholders. So for all those that are watching this video, we also had a presentation from Strathmore University where they are presenting the results of this project in Kenya. So thank you. Now let's move to the next speaker in this session. So we are going to focus now on libraries and the importance of connectivity for anchor institutions. So the next speaker is Don Means. Don is Director of Gigabit Libraries Network, and he has more than 25 years of experience in ICT. And right now he's the principal investigator for an IMLS grant enabling libraries to explore deploying their own community-scale wireless networks to support new public access stations. So this is a very important idea about connectivity, but also about resilience. So Don, thank you for accepting this invite from the DSA. We are very excited to have you here, and we really look forward to hearing from you. Please tell us about how you are trying to connect and bring in more connectivity for anchor institutions.
Thank you, Martha. Hello, it's great to be back. The last time I was addressing the DSA Global Summit was in Accra in 2014. So it's great to be back. I appreciate the opportunity to tell this story. I think we're applying principles related to open spectrum for public services, and most of our work revolves around the libraries. Slide, please. Thank you. I'm going to run through a series of projects as a developmental or evolutionary sequence of how we've gone through using technologies and applications. Slide, please. We started with the Fiber to the Library campaign. The Gigabit Libraries Network is an open global collaboration of libraries doing interesting, innovative things with technologies for a range of objectives. And there's no institution we've found that has more range of services, serves more people in more ways than the public libraries. We've been working in the area of community networking since the 80s. And then in the mid 2000s, we found the library as the natural vector for more of these issues than any other institution by a lot. Access, infrastructure, education, equity, speech, privacy. It just goes on and on. The motto of libraries is open to all, and it's hard to find anybody else that has such a motto without wanting your wallet or whatever. So we launched this campaign basically around the idea that the quickest, cheapest way to deliver next generation broadband into every community was to run fiber to all the U.S. libraries, roughly 17,000 facilities, and that would serve two purposes. One is it would deliver high capacity to a priority endpoint, and then it would also drive the infrastructure deeper into communities or markets and set up enable last mile connections as a so-called middle mile solution. That was encoded into the U.S. National Broadband Plan when we helped co-found the Schools, Health, and Libraries Broadband Coalition, the DC advocacy group, focused on this same idea of gigabit connectivity to anchor institutions as shared middle mile and serving these priority institutions. So the Fiber to the Library project led us to Whitespace, TV Whitespace. It came onto the scene in 2013. Of course, it's been in development since 2008 or so, but it was only available as pre-commercial technology in 2013. It fascinated us because as open spectrum, like Wi-Fi, anybody can use it. You just get the equipment, set it up, and you've got a network. And the idea that so many people depend on libraries for internet access, roughly 1 in 3 adults. This is just an astounding number to us. Roughly 80 million people, 14 and over in the US, rely on libraries for access to the internet. Now, most of them have some other source, but they go there for one reason or another. It's faster, it's convenient, it's warm, somebody there to help them, all these reasons. But it's a major service, a major public service. And yet everyone has to go to one of these facilities to access that service. And so then the idea of using TV Whitespace to extend library Wi-Fi, in a word, slide please, it seemed like a way to leverage a new and interesting technology, and relatively simple. If you're aware of the capabilities and capacities of TV Whitespace, you don't necessarily have to set up a tower. Most of our projects allowed the home base station antenna to be on top of the library building, and then to make connections miles around in the community to then support library Wi-Fi, regular routers in parks, playgrounds, and so forth. But it's library Wi-Fi as to make the distinction between public Wi-Fi, which is kind of an open connection to the internet. These are set up so that you're accessing the library, like a library splash page, which then offers you, well, where do you want to go? You want to go to the open internet? You want to check out a library book, talk to a librarian, whatever. But it's the library we see is a natural face of e-government, especially, and that everyone has a right, actually, to access public information and services. And yet, because so many people are not connected, slide please, not connected to the internet, even in the US, the FCC gives a number around 20 million, 25 million. Another study done by a private concern found that number is over 100 million. And as a technology company, they would be in the position to know. So we think of the US as an advanced economy with advanced infrastructure, but there are giant holes in it. And even if there aren't, there's always somebody in a certain circumstance that can need access. So this is an early project in Manhattan, Kansas, where we deployed a project, or they deployed it. It was that was part of the attraction of this, is that a reasonably competent system administrator could set up a community scale wide area network, and involving no third parties, no subscriptions, just as an in-house network that reaches around in a community. So this is what they did. Slide, please. And they found that the data usage was that in the summer months that more people moved more data through these remote kind of casual drop-by hotspots than they did in the library itself. And as a result of that, the city, they're really popular. Everybody loves free Wi-Fi. And as a result, the city decided they were going to run fiber to all 4 of those facilities: a swimming pool and an ice rink and a park and a senior center. And so they never would have, very unlikely they would have done that just on the idea of, let's run fiber to the swimming pool. Oh, well, not this year. But because they had hard data, it allowed them to justify the investment. That's the point. So in our view, wireless pulls fiber. you stimulate demand, slide please, and you foster connectivity. This is a basic diagram of a normal setup. It's a spoke and hub configuration. In this one, we're showing an omnidirectional antenna, but typically they're sectional. And then the remote antennas aim back at the base station to provide a good connection. Slide, please. In 2016, we initiated a project called Beyond the Wall and codified it into a grant project from the Federal Libraries Agency, the Institute for Museum and Library Services, who gave us funds that we then did an open call for proposals, asking libraries to come up with a plan for how this kind of a setup would benefit their community. And we had about 60 very credible proposals. We selected a handful, and we were able to do a couple more with some additional help from other sources, and started this this campaign to expand inclusion, and also as a secondary use to increase community resilience, so that these would provide a backup resource for various kind of circumstances, like outages or maybe a personal outage. You know, people can have problems with their own connection, their own services. Slide, please. That then led to a follow-on, kind of a phase two, community second nets, we call them, where libraries and other anchor institutions serve the role of second responders. So we know that, you know, fire and police and ambulance, all are emergency responders, so-called first responders. There's a national network that's been created over the last few years called FirstNet, just for those providers. But in large-scale events, what happens to everybody else? I mean, a general outage puts you literally in the dark. And we had an outage here. I'm in Marin County, where we're based, and we've had fires, as you may have heard, to the north. And the utility simply shut off the electricity to our county. Our whole county, 250,000 people, were without any electricity for 5 to 7 days. We had no immediate danger here, but it was eye-opener on how vulnerable we are to outages and how dependent we are on our connectivity. So the community second nets is basically the concept that that these networks, not just a library hub, but between other anchor institutions who also play the role of responders, you know, like a shelter or distribution point. You know, these large scale events have different, completely different circumstances, and the infrastructure is down for days or weeks, and so having any kind of backup or redundant capability increases resilience. And the point of the Second Nets grant was to kind of flip the dual use case of inclusion and resilience to focus on the resilience part, and how these units can be portable and self-powering, and even operate as a semi-autonomous network. Slide, please. So the other capability here is to connect directly among these so-called second responders, library to school to clinic to other public buildings, for example, so that if anything happens, you're still connected. Even just a simple outage or one facility to another, you now have a new link through one of your partners. And even if everything is out, you're able to communicate just between those facilities. And so this is running now for a second year. There are a lot of challenges with creating and operating autonomous networks to run ad hoc, but we're starting to see that. Slide, please. But we also see that these so-called normal disasters are not the only thing we're facing. And now a pandemic has landed on us. But while that's happening, the natural disasters, their severity and their frequency continue to increase. It's no surprise if anybody's paying attention to climate science, it's what's happening. And so, slide, please. So we're seeing, this is This is double the number of acres. This is just in California in the biggest fire season ever. It's already twice that amount, and it's still burning. It's a slide, please. And it goes on. We had this Derecho freak wind that destroyed 40% of the Iowa corn crop in one day last year. Slide, please. We had another day where 2 cyclones were arriving at the Gulf Coast at the same time. We've run out of names for these storms in the U.S., and now we're moving into letters of the Greek alphabet to keep up with them. It's just more evidence that we are in really serious circumstances, and we need to be more prepared for it and not just blowing through it. Slide, please. So this is an example. One library in South Dakota was able to redeploy one of the remote sites to a testing site that supporting the COVID virus testing. Slide. And these portability, more likely you're going to be able to use them to support some kind of a community event. So they fabricated a portable unit there, a prototype that they moved to support a marathon race. Slide, please. In a Georgia library, they're repurposing old payphones to set up as these, what we're calling neighborhood library access stations. And that these should be within easy reach of everybody, anywhere. Everybody in the world should have access to some kind of a public access point. Slide, please. Here's another one where we moved beyond TV Whitespace. We led with that because it's interesting, but it also is limited because it's not available everywhere, even in the US, because the channels are filled with broadcasters. It's great in the rural areas, but it's no way to set up a network, a backup network, is to be dependent on a single technology. This is a case where the school partnered with the library 4 miles away and shot a half a gig connection microwave to the little town 4 miles away and split it between the students and the library. It's evolving that way. Slide, please. Another case in a library in Texas where they partnered with the local WISP to use an educational broadband spectrum license that they had to support these access stations that were a great advantage to one family there that had no other source. Slide, please. One more case is LTE in CBRS, another school district partner with a library that they're connecting students and families in the town with their own network. They set this up themselves. So the capabilities are substantial. Slide, please. I'll wrap up here pretty quickly. I just want to touch on one more activity, and that is the Partnership for Public Access. It is a slide, please. So this is I'm sorry, go back one, please. This is a plan. A consortium are saying that there's basically no credible way, no credible strategy to connect the 3-something billion people in the world without a public access component. Current business models and technologies are not going to do it with any kind of incremental development. It's just too far to go. So a public access approach serves to both serve anyone anywhere, even if it's not as convenient as they'd like, but at least it's a place, and it also enables them, it supports them as libraries do. And so public access centers like libraries or community networks or even an offline internet can provide connectivity to virtually anyone, anywhere. Slide, please. And so we've issued this new declaration. This consortium of entities has issued a statement more or less to this effect. Slide. And saying that we want to mobilize the world's libraries to reach out and connect everyone and train and support people so they can be accomplished users. Libraries have been demand drivers for technology since books themselves. first generation broadband, many people had their first experience at a library, said, this is great. I don't want this dial-up anymore. I want whatever that is at home. Don't tell me about the technology, just give me the service. So libraries play this role, and it's undervalued and underestimated, but they are super valuable. It's a global community of professionals and an ancient institution that we should cherish. And we urge everyone to rethink libraries and support them. And check out the partnership p4pa.net. Slide, please. And thank you for your time. I apologize for running over, but it's great to be here. And thank you again.
Thank you very much, Don. I'm glad that you presented different examples about different implementations, and also the fact that you mentioned that there are different technologies that could be most suitable in different cases. I think that is part of the message we are trying to transmit in this DSA summit. It's like spectrum sharing offers a lot of opportunities, and then it's up to everyone to decide on which is the best context. And so regulation should be also flexible to enable different solutions for final users. So thank you for highlighting that and for providing examples from your experience.
Thank you, Mark.
So now we are going to move to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Jane Coffin. Jane is Senior Vice President at Internet Society. And I'm glad to mention that ISOC is one of the most recent DSA members. So we are very glad to strengthen this partnership with ISOC and to be able to work together. So Jane is working on different internet growth projects. She's leading different initiatives like community networks, like different opportunities for interconnection, peering, community development, and of course, different strategies in order to get more collaborative strategies for expanding internet infrastructure, access, and related capacities in emerging economies with partners. So we are glad to be one of those partners. Jane, thank you for accepting this invite, and we would love to hear from you about different actions that ISOC and you are personally leading. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta. And I'd just like to thank the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance for having us here and for your leadership and vision to include some different types of infrastructure development that are connecting people currently around the world and keeping us as a lifeline during COVID. And thank you to Don and Alessandra. You've set the stage. We're going to start in with some of the slides from the Internet Society, but I'd like to leave you with this thought. Our vision at the Internet Society is that the Internet's for everyone. And part of our mission is a globally connected, secure, trustworthy, and open Internet. And so what I'm going to bring to you today is some perspective on the globally connected part. And so we'll start in on some of our slides to tell you more about what we're doing to facilitate and help enable something called community networks. These are networks for, with, and by the community, built by community people to empower more connectivity around the world. As you've heard from some of our other speakers, half the world is connected. And right now during COVID, it's even more important that we're looking at how to connect people for socioeconomic development. So next slide, please. Yep, next slide. And as I've just mentioned, these are networks built for and by and with people in communities to enable connectivity and socioeconomic development. Next slide. As you can see, part of the trends we've been taking a look at is how, and what motivates us is that half of the global community is not connected. With half the population offline, this means that governments, business, and basic people need more connectivity to enable that development and that socioeconomic growth. I've been doing work in this space for over 20 years, and we do need change. And this is something that we're seeing with the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance, where we're looking at innovative uses of spectrum, first from spectrum sharing, for secondary use, direct allocations to non-traditional entities. So we're looking at a complementary approach with community networks. Another trend that we're seeing, to help link this up, is a slowdown in the rate at which people are coming online. So we're trying to boost that through digital inclusion, some of the projects that the team that Alessandra is working on, and thank you to the UK government for all the great work and vision here, because you've been a keen supporter of community networks, and we're grateful for that. And of course, as we noted, the COVID-19 pandemic clearly demonstrates the need for complementary forms of connectivity. At the local level, there is not enough affordable, agile, complementary access to the traditional way of networking. So this is not a threat, but a complement to the way that we can connect people and provide opportunity. Next slide, please. And I should say, in that slide behind us, that was an actual picture from a community network in New York City. It's called New York City Mesh. And that team has been actually running across the rooftops of New York during the COVID period, socially distanced. It's a group we've helped fund in the past and is working with others and doing lots to help provide that connectivity during COVID, during a pandemic, during a time when it's really important to focus on how to change policies, regulations, financing models to get folks like that up and running and more people connected. So community networks are diverse. It's important for people to understand that. We had a summit in Tbilisi last year. It was our European summit. And an economist that we've been working with said to me, "I get it now, Jane. This is not cookie cutter." I said, no, every country's different. Every country's regulatory policy environment's different. Every country's basic map of connectivity is different. So you've got to look at siting. You know, not all the networks are the same. The same summit in Georgia in Tbilisi highlighted a project we've been working on in a high mountain region called Tusheti. There are maybe 50 people in this region. The point is not the how many, but the fact that we brought in a network with that community. And we never want to be a single point of failure as a partner. That's why we're very keen to make sure the partnership base is strong. So we work with our local community, with entities like DFID and USAID, the World Bank, the Czech Development Agency, and the Georgian government and Georgian people themselves, to make sure that we can broaden the pyramid, again, the base, so that we have lots of people providing support, sustainability, so that when we're gone as a partner and donor, the project will continue. So we've got different types of sites, different technological setups. Don noted some. You have everything from mesh networks to TV Whitespace, to direct new open base station technology for 2G, 4G. You've got different purposes. Some communities feel disenfranchised, others needed connectivity during COVID. We've got examples of parents that didn't have connectivity at home because they relied on it at work or at school for their kids. That had to change quickly. So there are different focuses there. And there are different governance models. It can be for-profit, not-for-profit, a hybrid of both. There's a network that Alessandra and others are supporting, and our colleagues, APC, the Association for Progressive Communications, support a project in the Eastern Cape in South Africa. That Zenzeleni project started out as nonprofit. Now it's quasi-profit with a wireless internet service provider. So there's no one size fits all in this model. And I noted here, I want to make sure we have a shout out to Don on the library side, because the libraries have been great partners and are critical anchor institutions for community networks. And again, they can be cooperatives. We see this model in the United States. They can work with electrical cooperatives. They can work with small businesses. So it's whatever works in that type of community and whatever's legitimate from a government perspective. Next slide, please. So community networks are built by who, what? Is this just random people around the planet? They're built by champions in the field. They're built by normal people. Some are technologists. Some are people who want to see change. We've seen grandmothers in villages in Greece who I've sat with who've said, we want to feel more a part of our community again. We want our grandchildren to come back to the village. And with grandchildren coming back to the villages, they needed connectivity. One grandmother said to me, I need this thing called the internet. And I said, we'll work with you on that. But again, the network is built by the normal people who mobilize locally accessible other folks on the ground to bring in a community spirit. So that's why they're obviously called community networks. You deal with legal aspects, you're learning by doing, you're agreeing on governance structure with each other. There, as in any startup, a business plan may not last more than 8 months. You're going to constantly be changing to accommodate that community network to the community level. And you're going to be working at that local level to make it sustainable. So next slide, please. Policy and regulatory challenges. This is one of the barriers we've seen to community networks getting up off the ground, and one of the advantages. With projects like those that Alessandra and the team are working on, people like Dawn who are motivating others, DSA that are going out and working with different governments and policymakers and regulators to get that framework together to provide the base for legitimacy for these community networks, it's super critical. Some of the challenges in specific are the high cost and complex requirements for licensing and permits. I think this is for any business. If we make it simpler, more transparent, and clear, it will be very helpful to all businesses and to the community networks. There's a lack of access to spectrum, something we know well from the conversations at DSA in the years past and this year. We've got to find ways to innovatively look at assigning spectrum, sharing it, providing secondary use, or something new and innovative. This is something that colleagues around the world are working with us on, and we've seen governments take the lead on, and we're really excited to see actually the government of Ghana loosen up some spectrum this year when COVID hit. The US government looking at 6 gigahertz to provide more spectrum for mesh networks. This is really important. And what it tells us right now during COVID is that governments have agility. There are ways to change the old methods of doing things. And we want to be clear, we're not talking about a complete change in the way the spectrum regime works in a country, but just being more innovative, agile, providing more ability to come in and work with governments to find ways to bring in this complementary access in community networks. Other issues are lack of support for infrastructure sharing does inhibit access. Well, we need to make sure there are other ways for creative backhaul partnerships. We know that New York City Mesh in New York works with an IXP provided by DKIX, a German group in New York City for backhaul. And so that provides them access to the broader internet, which is really important for that network. Other things, and some of my favorite topics, are high taxes. Taxes and customs fees can put your internet in jail, and it can put your community network in jail if we can't get quick access to equipment. They can't sit in warehouses forever, and this equipment price points are coming down. So access to that equipment is really important for communities. Civil and criminal liability, another thing for people who are sharing internet access challenge. So that's something to think about when you're a government or a policymaker or regulator working with community networks. Find ways to make it easier for them to deploy. Next slide, please. Financial and sustainability challenges. There are limited access to financial resources for some community networks. Investment is difficult if you're a tribal community that's not allowed to use your land as collateral, for instance. Or for some local communities, we give them support in figuring out how to go after the grants, how to present themselves to banks and to present themselves to other donors. This is a critical thing to try and do. If you're a community out there, and it's important as a policymaker, regulator, or just as a partner to help bring that knowledge around for the community network on how to do what they're doing. Sustainability of the networks is a concern. This is something that, again, I mentioned earlier, building a broad base of a pyramid of support and donors and partners so that there's no single point of failure there. And when they've been initiated from an external perspective for a community, rather than with a community, you can have a sustainability challenge. So it's really important that there's a shared understanding of why you're doing what you're doing in agreement from the get-go. Next slide, please. So critical aspect of what we do with community networks is to figure out the policy and regulatory landscape. Again, we often work with partners. We survey and have experts on the ground ourselves, or we work through regional communications associations like CITEL in Latin America, or the African Telecommunication Union in the African area. What that does is it gives us support in finding the governments that are supportive of change, looking at ways that they can work with community networks to provide connectivity, easier time to deploy, and clearer ways to understand regs, policies, access to spectrum, licensing, and financing. So what we work with community, with policymakers and regulators for community network development and employment, we look at innovative licensing solutions and working with governments to do that. Mexico led the way with something called social purpose licensing a few years ago. That concept has caught on. Brazil is looking at ways to create more innovative use of licensing as well. We've seen change in Uganda on licensing. So this is something that's catching on with regulators and policymakers as they're being held responsible for looking at local access and more affordable access. So community networks are a way that they're seeing that are very viable. We're talking to policymakers and regulators, as I mentioned earlier, about easing certain requirements and obligations attached to licensing, registration procedures, making it easier. This is better for business in general. Again, reducing and waiving licensing fees, looking at how you tax, apply customs duties and levies, and expand license exemption for certain spectrum bands, or secondary use, as I mentioned earlier. Easier ways of explaining that, which is something that DSA has been so great at working with governments on, and that we've been working with them on some of that as well. And again, as I mentioned earlier, creative incentives for sharing spectrum, particularly in the rural, remote areas, particularly with spectrum that's not being used. We would note that recently there was a great proceeding in the United States it was called the Tribal Priority Window. For the first time, tribal communities were allowed to put their names in to see if they could obtain spectrum in an auction proceeding where they wouldn't have to go through an auction. So this is something we worked on with tribal communities, and it was a great success. Over 250 tribes applied for something that the authorities thought only 6 tribes would apply for. There is spectrum out there. It's not being used, and we can use it to help connect people. Next slide. More of what we do with policymakers and regulators. I'm not going to read down through this whole list, but there are other ways that you can find a menu of options wherever you are to make sure that you're aware of what the rules and regs are and how you can better work with policymakers and regulators. It's really important to see change. As another colleague had mentioned the other day to me, we have old infrastructure in the policy, regulatory, financing side that was built around the old telco model. The internet model is more agile. It's network to network. We've got to take a look at putting that policy and regulatory environment together in a more agile way, more flexible, able to change, and able to finance and come up with more creative financing, perhaps with universal service funds and or just basic funds to provide access for community networks to better funding models. Next slide, please. Civil society and community organizations like the Internet Society, APC, and others, Don's group with the library associations, very important to work with all of our organizations. Bring us into your proceedings. We're working right now on response to the Ethiopian government on universal service. This gives us access to helping the regulator formulate a more agile policy, particularly when they're looking at a wholesale, a new approach. And this is important that we're considered in some of your proceedings as partners, because we haven't been in the past, and this is a great opportunity to bring in new expertise and new learning. Next slide, please. More on the civil society organizations, how we can help you look at ways that we can find people on the ground to give you a reality check of what's needed and how to help certain communities participate from a community networking perspective. Next slide, please. It's very important to work with network operators and businesses. I'm not going to go down through this list, but there are ways that we can come up with backhaul options together. There are ways that we can work on regulatory proceedings to create more clarity, simplicity, and collaboration. Next slide, please. And I'm going to wrap up. To find out more about community networks, you can visit our website, take a look at APC's website as well, the Dynamic Coalition on Community Connectivity and Wireless for Communities, and the P4PA group that Don had mentioned. Next slide, please. Just a thank you to everyone for giving us the opportunity to provide you with more information about community networks and the work that we're doing and others. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jane. And I really appreciate the fact that you have highlighted the different perspectives policy, investment, all that is important because sometimes we focus only on one part of the puzzle. And it's important to have the complete overview in order to get a larger impact. So thank you for that and for this very clear presentation. So I would just like to see if we could come all to stage for a final message. And now that we are all back on the stage, I would like to ask you a final question. Many different regulators are attending this DSA summit. So I would like to ask you if you could give a short message, 1 minute message for regulators and authorities attending this summit. What would it be? What do you think is the most important aspect for them to act in terms of connectivity?
So I'm happy to jump in, Marta. For policymakers and regulators around the world that are listening in, it's really important to be as agile as possible and to allow different forms of connectivity, complementary connectivity. COVID is showing us what we still need to do to connect the world. And it's really important to allow in these different forms of access. So we're going to give you a pitch for community networks, and there are great examples around the world of where governments are making change to allow in better licensing, different use of spectrum, different financing models. So we'd also like to just thank you again, Marta, for the opportunity to present. And we know you've got some great ways forward with spectrum. So we just thank everyone and just hope that the policymakers and regulators can help us with change, because right now we're being held accountable for the lack of connectivity, and we have a great opportunity to connect people.
Thank you, Jane. Don, would you like to go next?
Okay. Yeah, I would like to make one distinction here. We talk about, access, participation in the digital society and so forth, and that everybody should have access and so they could thrive, et cetera. But it's a point about responsibility that I would like to make to the regulators and the governments, that it is their responsibility to assure that everyone has access to public information and public services, especially. These are, this is public domain information that is created by the governments. And who are they for? They're for people that are connected. So using universal service funds, which need reform almost everywhere, even in the US, maybe especially in the US, but this is designed to allow a baseline of access for everyone. And that should be a goal. Yes, we all want super performance, but there should be a minimum basic standard of access that everyone has. And I think the regulators and the leads of all these governments are in position to provide that at not great cost. So I urge that on everyone who may be interested in that point.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Don. And Alessandra.
Thank you so much. I will just basically build on the excellent points that Jane and Dom have made. For us, as a donor that works in digital development as FCDO, we think that the role of telecom regulators and of ICT telecom line ministries, so to say, and also ICT authorities in all the partner countries where we work, is really fundamental in ensuring digital transformation in the country, but also specifically digital inclusion, and also to really put a strong emphasis on this aspect of responsibility that Dom was talking about. It's about making sure that we are all together feeling responsible, that people are included in a safe and secure manner. I think with COVID-19, what has been happening in the past few months, it has become absolutely evident for everybody that digital inclusion and digital access are not a luxury. They are a fundamental human right at this point. We are trying to work as hard as we can with stakeholders in country to make sure that communities can have access to, for instance, public health messaging, which at this point is almost like a matter of survival. But really, we cannot do it on our own. The role of the regulators in particular is fundamental And we urge them, and I think they're already making a huge effort in that, and we're very grateful for that. They're very open to dialogue, which is great. But we urge them really to look at the different models and the different ways of doing things, keeping in mind their mind open, and also being, seeking support where needed to face sometimes market structures which are a little bit rigid, a bit difficult to deal with. There is a political economy of it that is really not easy to navigate for key for regulators and policymakers. So we are there as, let's say, a neutral supporter to provide what can be provided in terms of technical assistance and capacity building, but really cannot do it without their role, which is fundamental. So in brief, digital inclusion, digital transformation, responsible digital, we have to work on it together, but please keep your minds open to all the possible models, especially the ones that are important at the last mile, like community networks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alessandra. And I would like to close with that final message, like working together, like partnerships. And that's the idea, and that's what we are, one of the goals of this DSA summit. There are so many virtual events now, there are so many meetings, but it's important to focus on the important aspects, on what really matters. So thank you for attending this session, and please continue attending and watching all the different sessions during the summit. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.